You are sitting alone in a quiet room, thinking you are just another ordinary person in a crowded world. Your phone is silent, your thoughts are loud, and you wonder why your mind never seems to rest. You don't realize that the way you think, the way you notice things, and the way you feel so deeply is what makes you different. What feels like loneliness is actually the space where your strongest ideas are being born. This story begins inside that quiet room, where a mind far more powerful than it knows is slowly waking up. You ever sit in a room, quiet, and suddenly feel like your thoughts are louder than the world around you? Like they're a river, rushing through every corner of your mind, spilling into places it shouldn't, twisting and looping over the same bridge again and again. That's where he was, sitting by the window of his apartment, the city lights flickering faintly against the glass, a cup of untouched coffee cooling beside him, and wondering why his mind never seemed to stop. The noise wasn't outside, it was inside. Every thought was a spark, a question, a connection he couldn't switch off, and yet, he felt trapped by it. He had always been the type to overthink, but lately it had become an art, almost like a compulsion, a game his brain played while he just watched, and in that silence, he realized he wasn't broken, he was different, he thought differently. And maybe that was a kind of gift. He remembered conversations he'd had over the years, sitting in circles where people raced to speak, eager to fill the void, desperate to be heard. He'd often said nothing, listening instead, feeling every word in the room, weighing it, folding it in, letting it simmer before it reached his lips. Some called him shy, others quiet. But he knew better. It wasn't about fear. It was about precision. Every word he spoke was filtered, measured, because the last thing he wanted was to scatter energy into the air without reason. Speaking for him was like lighting a candle he didn't want it to burn for no one. There was a weight to words, he understood, a gravity most people ignored, and in those moments of silence, he felt strangely powerful, even in his own solitude. Walking down crowded streets, he noticed patterns where others saw randomness, the rhythm of conversations, the subtle gestures, the way a neighbor steps echoed another block away, all of it connected in ways most people couldn't grasp. He once tried explaining it, but it sounded obsessive, ridiculous even. The world, to him, was a network of invisible threads, and while others ignored them, he felt pulled along every single one, sometimes exhilarated, often exhausted. He was the type to question everything: why the sky was that particular shade of gray, why traffic lights seemed to sync with moods, why people laughed when no one said anything funny. Curiosity wasn't a choice, it was a lens, and it made him feel alive in ways the mundane never could. At night, he sat with his notebooks scattered across the table, writing ideas no one would read. He mapped systems that made life easier, solved problems nobody had asked him to solve. It was like he was in his own workshop of the mind, turning every inefficiency into a puzzle, every routine into a challenge. Sometimes, he thought it was lonely work, but mostly, it brought a strange joy, a clarity that was absent in his daytime interactions. His mind was a machine constantly assembling pieces the rest of the world hadn't even noticed were missing. It was exhausting and exhilarating at once, a paradox that had become his constant companion. Books surrounded him, stacked high, pages folded and marked, ideas intersecting across philosophy, history, science, and art. He didn't read for the sake of reading. He read to see how other minds worked, to collect frameworks and models, to fold them into his own thinking. On some evenings, he'd close a book and just stare out at the street below, realizing that his mind had been running miles ahead, combining, dissecting, connecting. Reading wasn't a hobby, it was fuel, a way to stretch the contours of thought and imagination. He wondered how many people felt the same hunger and didn't know how to feed it. He had learned, slowly, to think in layers, not circles. Most people worried in loops, repeating yesterday's anxieties tomorrow. But he imagined every possible outcome, tested scenarios, played through failures in his head until every decision felt almost inevitable. Others might call it overthinking, he called it rehearsal. Every choice became a mental chessboard, every consequence considered, every move preempted. And yet, there were times when the weight of foresight was heavy, like holding a stone in your chest while the world spun freely around you. He was aware of it though, aware that most of life couldn't be predicted, but still compelled to try. And then there was the silence. He had come to crave it in ways most people feared, while others flinched at empty rooms. He sat comfortably in the quiet, letting thoughts settle like sediment in a glass of water. In those moments, ideas emerged from nowhere, clarity sparkled like lightning across the sky of his mind. Silence wasn't emptiness. It was the place where he could breathe, where the chaos of everyday life untangled itself into something almost manageable. Friends thought he was distant. He knew better. He was present. just inwardly, fully absorbed by a process invisible to everyone else. Self-honesty had become his mantra, though it often felt brutal. Mistakes were his responsibility, failures his teacher, mediocrity his enemy. He didn't have the luxury of excuses. He had the discipline to confront the truth, however uncomfortable. It was this rigorous honesty that honed his mind, sharpened his instincts, and kept him moving forward even when others faltered. It wasn't arrogance. It was accountability, a quiet but unyielding force in the way he lived. He had also learned that energy mattered more than time. While the world hustled by the clock, he paid attention to the rhythm of his mind. He knew when creativity surged, when focus sharpened, when rest was necessary. Days were segmented not by hours, but by mental flow. He didn't force productivity. He followed the tides of attention and let inspiration find him. It was liberating, in a sense, to understand that the mind had its own schedule, indifferent to calendars and alarms. And yet, aligning with that rhythm required patience, observation, and trust in himself. The world often expected him to sound ordinary, to conform, to mask brilliance under the guise of simplicity. And he did, not out of deceit, but out of empathy. He had learned to communicate in ways people could understand, translating complex thoughts into words that didn't alienate, that connected. Genius, he realized, wasn't measured by vocabulary or spectacle. It was measured by the ability to share ideas without fear, without ego, without needing to impress. He had discovered that the greatest power lay in being understood, not admired. Through it all, he carried a quiet awareness that life was a series of subtle revelations, tiny shifts in perception that added up over time. He didn't need accolades to validate the hours spent in thought, the nights spent unraveling puzzles, or the long walks alone with his mind. The realization came gently, almost imperceptibly. The patterns, the deep thinking, the silent contemplation, were not burdens, they were gifts. And understanding that, even in part, brought relief, clarity, and a calm acceptance of his own pace, his own path. He had learned to navigate overthinking, not as a curse, but as a tool. He observed, reflected, and then acted. He discovered that patience with his mind, rather than impatience, led to insights others rarely experienced. Every loop of thought became a step forward, every anxious swirl a lesson in strategy, every quiet evening a sanctuary for reflection. The world remained noisy, chaotic, and demanding, but he no longer felt crushed by it. He had found balance, not in controlling the world, but in understanding the mind that carried him through it. And as the evening settled into night, he leaned back, finally letting the tension dissolve with the hum of the city outside. He felt a quiet hope, fragile but real, that even in the complexity of thought, even in the restless corridors of the mind, there was room to breathe, room to grow, and room to simply be. It wasn't a promise of instant clarity, but a reassurance that the mind, with all its quirks, all its hidden strengths, could be a friend rather than a foe. And in that gentle understanding, he smiled to himself, knowing that the path forward was not about perfection, but about awareness, persistence, and the courage to think freely. If you've ever felt this way, sitting quietly with thoughts racing, know you're not alone. There's strength in observation, in curiosity, in reflection. And if you want to keep exploring these stories of the mind, the subtle ways we grow, and the quiet power that lies within, join us here on Mind Focus Key, and discover the hidden layers of your own thought, the unseen habits that shape every decision, and the mind's potential waiting quietly to be awakened. Thanks for watching.